Well, welcome to Unit 3 of our class. This week we're going to be focusing on overweight and obesity, both in adults and in children. Your asynchronous lecture for this week is going to focus more on overweight and obesity in adults, and then when we meet together as a class for our live WIMBA session, we'll be focusing on overweight and obesity in children. And really, if I had to say what is the #1 health epidemic in the United States, I would say it's absolutely obesity, primarily because it leads to so many other health problems. And definitely in the world of nutrition, this is the #1 thing that we're finding that we pay attention to and is evolving in the research. So let's get right into it. Let's talk about the prevalence of overweight and obesity in the U.S. You yourself might be listening to this lecture feeling a little self-conscious about your weight, and if so, you are certainly not alone. In fact, the magnitude of obesity and overweight in the United States has grown so drastically since the 1980s that it's really hard to kind of put into words what that sounds like. Statistics don't seem to do it justice. So I'd like to start out with a little bit of a visual cue to help you kind of get an idea about how much the obesity trends have changed since the early to mid 80s. So you're looking at a map right now from the CDC from 1985. This is from the Behavioral Risk Factor Surveillance Survey. And this is one of the nutrition monitoring surveys that we do across the U.S. that helps us to get an idea of people's health behaviors and what their weight is. This map represents the data of folks that have a BMI of approximately 30 pounds overweight for 5.4-inch person, or a BMI equal to or greater than that of 30. So this represents our obesity trends in 1985. And as you can see, in the early 80s, 1985, mid 80s, I guess, we really didn't have that much data, right? We see a lot of missing states. But for those states that we did have data, even the heaviest states were ranking in at about 10 to 14% obesity levels. Now I'm going to kind of quickly go through these slides just so that you can see as things change and we start to get more data on our states in 1990. By 1994, we have firm obesity data and trends on all of the states. And now we see we've got a new color here. So we're up to 15 to 19% obesity among U.S. adults in some of our U.S. states. In 1997 was when we had to add another color to the CDC maps, representing a BMI of at least 20%, an obesity level of at least 20%. In 2001, we increased again to make sure that we accounted for the obesity level of at least 25% that started shaping in our southern states. You can see that trend continuing through the mid-2000s as we add equal to or greater than 30% obesity. 2007, 2008, 2009, 2010. And this is the last map I have to show you because this is the most recently released by the CDC. And as you can see at this point, we do not have one state in the U.S. with less than a 20 to 24% obesity rate among U.S. adults, which is quite scary. So when you think about that huge change between 1985 and 2010, it kind of helps to give you a picture of what the magnitude of this health epidemic is looking like. So we just keep growing and growing as a nation. Just how big are we? Well, right now, approximately 67% of all American adults are overweight. About 50% of those are considered obese. 44% of our American children ages 2 to 19 are overweight. When we break that down into age range, that's about 21% of preschoolers and 37% of early elementary school children. About 58% of American pets are overweight. That's scary. So that's sort of an indicator of the fact that partly we're used to seeing things that are bigger, including our pets, so we don't necessarily realize when they're overweight. And of course, when Americans aren't active themselves, they're much less likely to be walking with their dogs, running with their dogs. And so we know that overweight among pets is also a huge epidemic among the veterinary community in the United States. The Journal of the American Medical Association and the World Health Organization have recently declared obesity as overtaking tobacco as the leading cause of death for preventable disease in America and also across the globe. That's really scary because it wasn't until just up until a few years ago that we thought nothing could surpass tobacco use as being the #1 most preventable cause. And guess what, folks? Obesity has done it. And while we like to say, that or a lot of researchers like to say that America is the one with the big problem. Frankly, it's happening across the globe. The term globesity was termed in the early 2000s, and really that reflects the fact that countries over in Europe, as well as some additional areas of the globe, are starting to catch up to America, although we're at one of the worst rates. So let's talk about what we mean when we define overweight and obesity and how those statistics came about. Let's begin with the origin of fatness. So I want you guys to understand that the regulatory processes that balance energy intake and expenditure so that the body weight, to determine your body weight is really set near a biologically determined set point. Everybody has their own set point. That set point can make it very difficult for people to lose weight, not as difficult for people to gain weight. It's helpful for maintaining body weight, but it can also be really frustrating. If a person slowly tries to cut calories, their body usually perceives this energy imbalance and perceives that they're starving in some way, so it tries to protect their body weight. This is particularly the case if you cut calories too drastically too soon. So many times someone will say, I really want to go on a diet. I have a certain amount of weight I want to lose within whatever it is, a week, a month, 6 months, and so I'm going to take my normal calorie level that I intake of 2,000 calories, and I'm going to drop that back to 1,600 calories or 1,200 calories. Well, the danger in that is that because your body has a set point, your body perceives that it's starving. So everything you take in, your body holds on to as fat, making it very difficult for you to lose weight. The body can more easily accommodate to a new higher set point if you gain weight over time. This again makes it difficult to lose weight because if you've been gaining weight steadily for say the last 10, 15, 20 years and now you want to start losing weight, your set point now is much higher than it was when you were say 18 or 20. So that's one of the reasons why when we're encouraging people who are trying to go on a weight loss program, we encourage them to lose no more than 1 to 2 pounds of weight per week. That's because we're trying to help slowly reset their set point. And if we do it too quickly, the set point will not allow us to do that, and their body will hold on to everything as fat. Bottom line is your body has a greater resistance to adapting a lower set point than a higher one. And that's why many people who lose weight will see it come back months later. Because just when they start going to the slightest variation in their diet and go back to what it was, or even if they haven't gone back to what their diet is, they may find that if they lost weight too quickly, it will start to come back. That's the body's set point kicking in. This is one of the reasons why exercise is so critical for weight maintenance and weight loss. We have many research studies that show that somebody can lose weight through dieting alone, but if they don't diet and exercise, then they're more likely to gain their weight back. Through exercise, you can help to reset your set point to a lower number, and this will allow you to maintain your weight loss. Obesity is a multifactorial disease. It's influenced by both genetics and the environment. And I find it very frustrating when people tell me, oh, well, the reason why I can't lose weight is because everybody in my family is big. Well, sometimes I like to remind people that genetics are hereditary factors may load the gun, that's true, but your lifestyle factors pull the trigger. And you have the ability to change your environment and make lifestyle choices to help prevent that obesity from realization. We do know that overweight early in life leads to overweight in adulthood. So if you were an overweight child, you're more likely to be an overweight teenager. You're also more likely to be an overweight adult. It definitely does not mean that you are destined for this lifestyle. If you make healthy lifestyle changes, you can change your weight at any point in time, no matter where you are in your set point, no matter where you are at your stage in life. But we do have plenty of research to show that statistically, overweight children tend to become overweight adults. One of the biggest reasons why we see so many obesity increases a lot is because we have such changed basal metabolic rates from what we used to have. So let's talk about what a BMR is and what it means and how your age influences this. The BMR is the rate at which your body uses energy to support its basic and voluntary functions. So your BMR is the rate at which you're burning calories all day long just to exist. These are the calories that your body burns in order to function, so that your liver functions normally, your brain functions normally. If you were laying on the couch doing absolutely nothing, not even moving. Your BMR would determine how many calories you're burning while you're at rest. It is the largest component of your energy expenditure. Changing your BMR is the best way to lose weight. And we'll talk in a minute about how you do this, but really the most influential way to do this is through exercise. Because when people exercise, they tend to be very focused on how many calories they're burning during that exercise. You know, they look at the little numbers in the treadmill and they say, oh, I really want to burn 350 calories, so I'm just going to keep running till I get there. And I like to tell people, well, what you burn during exercise is pretty meaningless. It's what you're burning during the other 23 and a half hours per day that really matters. That's your basal metabolic rate. And what we know is that as we grow older, our basal metabolic rate slows down. This is a problem that's called creeping obesity. The reason why it slows down is not just because you're getting older, though, folks. It's because you're losing muscle mass. As you lose muscle mass, you lose your BMR. It goes down, and as your BMR goes down, your body fatness creeps up. The best weapon against this is physical activity, especially strength training. And it's never too late to strength train. We have research that shows that for people who strength train as late as their 80s and 90s at 3 days a week for only 20 minutes a session, can still decrease their body fat and increase their metabolic rate. That's because for every pound of muscle that you put on, you burn an additional 50 calories at rest. When you're sitting around doing absolutely nothing, when you're laying on the couch watching TV, if you have muscle in your body and you have firm muscle in your body, you're going to be burning calories. But guess what you're burning with fat? Nothing. So creeping obesity is a huge problem for a lot of people, and it's one of the reasons why we see that as people grow older, they tend to have a harder time staying thin and staying at a healthy body weight. Body mass index is the formula, it's the tool that we use in the medical community and in the health community to very quickly determine whether or not somebody is overweight. And it's simply a formula of weight in kilograms divided by height in meters squared. It doesn't give the whole story, but it is considered to be a reliable indicator of body fatness. What's great about the BMI is that it's inexpensive and it's easy to perform. So for screening purposes, it's ideal because you can very quickly say to somebody, this is my age, this is my height, this is my weight, this is my height, and they can just plug it into a BMI calculator and have a general indicator as to your weight health. Again, it's not perfect, and we'll talk more about it, but it's inexpensive, it's easy to perform. If you want to know what your own BMI is, of course you could calculate this formula by hand or with a calculator, or you could do what most researchers do, and you could simply Google BMI calculator, and you'll find thousands of calculators on the internet where you can just plug in your weight and height, and it'll give you your BMI. The thing about a BMI is that it's a screening tool, not a diagnostic tool. Recall that last week I talked to you about how we determine whether or not through nutrition monitoring somebody needs nutrition assessment. And I told you that we usually start by nutrition screening, a quick and dirty way to see what their dietary intake is. Well, BMI is just a body weight screening. It doesn't say for certain that you're overweight. It doesn't say for certain that you're obese. But it gives us the ability to do a really quick red flag, for example. It also allows people to compare their own weight status to that of the general population. And for children and teens, it's important to remember that the interpretation of body mass index is both age and sex specific, simply because as children age and they grow taller, it affects their weight, and certain genders grow, more quickly than others relative to one another. So as we talk about overweight and obesity in children in our synchronous class this week, I'll explain a little bit more about how BMI works with children. But just understand for adults, your BMI is a straight number, whereas for children, every time you see a BMI for children or a teenager, and for the CDC that's considered anywhere from 2 to 19 years old, then the BMI would be rated as a BMI percentile because it would be the percent compared to that gender and that age. So one of the reasons why we use BMI in the medical community to do a very quick screening for overweight is because it helps us determine somebody's disease risk. If you look at this chart, you'll see a BMI of less than 18.5 is considered underweight, while a BMI of 18.5 up to 25 is considered normal, 25 and above is considered overweight, 30 to 35 is considered obese, 35 and above would be considered severe obesity, and when we have a BMI of equal to or greater than 40, that's considered morbid obesity or super obesity in the public health and medical community. And on the right-hand side of this table, you'll see that a normal weight gives you a normal disease risk, whereas being underweight or overweight gives you a slightly increased disease risk, and being obese, severely obese, or morbidly obese, or super obese gives you a high, very high, or extremely high risk for disease. Additional disease risks that doctors look at when they're evaluating somebody's body fatness and body weight is their waist circumference. So for men, if they have a waist circumference of greater than 40 inches, for women, a waist circumference of greater than 35 inches, that would be considered additional disease risk. If you want to know where your waist should be measured for the medical community, go ahead and take a tape measure and put it around your belly button. You can suck in. You don't have to let it out completely, so you can suck in. But if you see that you're above that 40 inches, guys, or you're above that 35 inches, women, that's an indicator that you could be at an increased risk for developing disease. There's also been research to show that 12 pounds or more of weight gain since 18 to 20 years old can be an indicator of disease risk. Poor aerobic fitness, of course, and then specific races and ethnic groups are prone to more diseases than others, depending on the exact disease that you're discussing. What this chart shows is that with increased BMI, we have increased mortality. But also when somebody is underweight, they have increased mortality as well. And the reason why I wanted to share this with you is because just a few years ago, there was a research study that came out that got a lot of press because it indicated that people who were just slightly overweight were at a lower disease risk. And the media took it completely the wrong way, did not interpret the article correctly, and we spoke about that a little bit last week when I talked to you about using good quality peer-reviewed journal articles and the media's need for sensationalism. And so for those of us who went back and looked at the original research, we saw what the researchers were actually saying was being slightly overweight is more protective for disease risk than being very underweight. Well, that's not very exciting, right? We know that being very underweight or being overweight and above is increased disease risk, and we've known that for quite some time. So it's also increased mortality risk. So how reliable is the BMI? Well, it's not perfect. The correlation between BMI and body fatness is fairly strong, but it varies by sex, by race, and by age. For example, at the same body mass index, women tend to have more body fat than men, and at the same body mass index, older people tend to have more body fat than younger adults. BMI is also not perfect in that it fails to account for a variety of really important factors when it comes to your weight and your disease risk. For example, adiposity, meaning where is it on your body that you store your fat? If you store your fat around your middle section, you have greater risk for disease and mortality than if you tend to store your fat around your butt, hips, and thighs. It doesn't account for muscular frames and for muscle. So what this means is that somebody who has a lot of muscle development would have a higher BMI, but it certainly doesn't mean that they have more body fat, and it definitely doesn't mean that they're at an increased risk of disease. If you took the body mass index for Shaquille O'Neal, for example, he would have a morbidly obese BMI. Now, the guy's not morbidly obese. He just happens to have a lot of muscle on his body. So his BMI really wouldn't be a very fair indicator of his level of body fatness. Similarly, athleticism. So your level of fitness. The BMI can't tell me your level of fitness. I don't know if you have poor aerobic fitness or if you can run a marathon or if you're a baseball player, a football player, or you're a wrestler. Depending on what sport you play, your BMI might be very high or very low. And frame size. I'm a very petite woman, so my BMI may indicate that I'm underweight when in fact I'm a perfectly healthy weight and body fat for my size. Similarly, I have a lot of friends and even family members who are very big boned, right? These are the ones that when they were kids, everybody referred to them as husky. Well, if you're somebody like that and your family is naturally big boned, then you're going to have a much higher BMI. It doesn't mean you have too much body fat. It doesn't mean you're not fit. and it certainly doesn't mean you're at a greater increase for disease necessarily. It just means that the BMI isn't the most accurate indicator for your level of body fatness and disease risk. You're looking at a figure right now from a study that was based on about 613 men and 876 women. And what this shows is that BMI correlates with body fat mass in a curvilinear fashion for both men and for women. The relationship between BMI and body fat is sex and age dependent, but at an equivalent BMI, women and older persons will always have a higher percent body fat than men and younger persons, and that's okay. In addition, people who have a larger muscle mass can have an obese body mass index despite having a normal amount of body fat, while those who have excess body fat and reduced muscle mass may show up as having a normal BMI, but it certainly doesn't mean that they're any healthier. So how much fat is too fat for your good health? Obesity experts evaluate risk to health from obesity using 3 indicators. Body fat's not the only answer. One is the BMI, or the body mass index. That's our first indicator. Like I said, it's our quick and dirty screening to raise a red flag. The second is your waist circumference. Waist circumference tells us a lot, and we're going to get into that more in a second. And also your disease risk profile and your family medical history. It really matters. If you tend to come from a family where heart disease is prevalent and runs early in your family, well then you're more at risk for developing early heart disease, even if you have a normal level of body fat. So what's your medical history? What's your family's medical history? How big is your waist? And what's your BMI? Those are the 3 indicators that obesity experts use to evaluate your health risks. Waist-to-hip ratio is considered by many obesity experts and by many nutritionists to be the most effective way to really examine your regional fat distribution. What I mean by this is, where on your body do you carry your body fat? A lot of times we refer to this as being an apple versus being a pear. Somebody is considered an apple when the majority of their body fat happens centrally on their body, and they're considered a pear when the majority of their body fat happens lower on their body. Your waist needs to be measured at the natural waist, which is the smallest part, or at the belly button. For some people, the belly button is not the smallest part of their body. So for you, if the smallest part of your body is above your belly button, that's where you'd measure for your waist. Your hip is the maximum circumference of your buttocks. So going around your butt, that's considered your hip measurement. When you divide your hip measurement into your waist measurement, you obtain what's called the WHR, the waist to hip ratio. And as you can see from this table, your health risk is largely dependent on what your waist to hip ratio is, knowing that people who are apples, meaning they have greater waist to hip ratio, tend to also have greater risk for disease. You may have heard in the media or read in peer-reviewed journal articles that the fat that you carry around your middle, your stomach, is more dangerous than any other fat on your body. And that's true. That's why we worry so much about your waist circumference. And the reason why is because the body fat that you store in your stomach, called visceral fat, is located deep within your central abdominal area, and it raises your risk for hypertension, which is high blood pressure, heart disease, stroke, and diabetes, both type 1 and type 2. We also know that your risk of death from all causes might be higher if you have more central obesity, meaning more fat around your waist, than if you have your primary fat deposits elsewhere in the body. This is good news for a lot of women who tend to be more likely to be pear shapes than men. Women tend to carry more of their fat around their butt, their hips, and their thighs. While they may not like the way they feel in their jeans, it is slightly protective for their risk of heart disease, stroke, diabetes, and hypertension, as compared to if they were to carry their fat around their middle. There are certain factors that affect your body fat distribution, and they're personal to you. One of those is gender. So like I just said, women, you're more likely to carry your fat around your butt, your hips, and your thighs. Men, you're more likely to have more of this visceral fat, this central obesity. Menopause. Ladies, as you get older and your hormones change, you are more likely to carry fat around your middle. That's why being physically active is important at all stages of your life. Smoking. People who smoke are more likely to have body fat distribution around their stomach. Alcohol intake. Because alcohol is really nothing but sugar, and we tend to store sugar around our stomach area. People who drink a lot of alcohol tend to have greater amounts of central obesity. That's where we get that term beer gut from. And physical activity. How physically active are you? If you're more physically active, well, then you usually have less amounts of central obesity. Less physically active, of course, you're at greater risk of suffering from central obesity. Why does it raise your risk of all early death and disease? Well, two main reasons. One, we know that visceral fat can have a significant contribution to your LDL, which is considered your bad cholesterol, and LDL increases your risk for heart disease. Two, we know that any fat accumulation, but especially fat around your abdomen, activates your metabolic reactions and leads to inflammation. And there's lots of research to show that inflammation is linked with heart disease. Abdominal fat relationships with heart disease. Let's talk about this for a minute. It's scary how much research is out there to show that abdominal obesity predicts cardiovascular heart disease risk independent of your BMI, smoking, cholesterol, and hypertension. So even if you have a low BMI, you're a non-smoker, your cholesterol's okay, and you don't have high blood pressure, if you have abdominal obesity, you are still at an increased risk for cardiovascular heart disease. It's also a predictor independent of total body fatness. So even if you have a very healthy total body fat overall, if you carry most of your fat around your middle, you are more likely to have a higher risk for heart disease. Abdominal obesity also statistically accounts for differences in heart disease rates between men and women. We know that it's strongly influenced by genetics. So we see that there's a similar gain among twins. There's a greater amount of abdominal obesity in smokers than in non-smokers. And it's preferentially lost during a physical activity program. So the more you exercise, the less likely you are to have abdominal obesity. Let's talk about some of the health consequences of overweight and obesity. And these are just some. In fact, we could probably teach an entire class strictly on the health consequences of overweight and obesity. I just want to take a few minutes here. So what are the risks from overweight? Most overweight and obese people suffer illnesses, and obesity is considered a chronic illness. An estimated 300,000 people in the U.S. die each year from what we call obesity-related diseases. For example, if somebody develops type 2 diabetes because of their obesity, which is very common right now in the U.S., and they die of complications from their type 2 diabetes, we would consider them dying from obesity-related disease. Over 70% of obese people suffer from at least one other health problem. When we have these additional health problems, they're called comorbidities. What's so scary about overweight and obesity, and that's why I say it's the #1 health epidemic that I'm concerned about, is that it leads to so many other health problems. It's not isolated in and of itself. So comorbidities are a very real risk, and 70% of obese people suffer from at least one other comorbidity. In fact, and we'll talk about this a little bit more when we get into pediatric obesity in our live class, in a population-based sample of 5 to 17-year-olds, 70% of obese children had at least one risk factor for cardiovascular disease, while 39% of obese children had 2 or more risk factors. How scary is that? So things like high cholesterol levels, high blood pressure, and abnormal glucose tolerance, which are early indicators for type 2 diabetes. And I'm going to bring this up again in the pediatric obesity lecture, because I just think that this is so stunning and so important, and I want us to take a few minutes to talk about it while we're together. Some of the physical health risks associated with obesity, and please know this is not a comprehensive list, include an increased risk of heart disease, high blood pressure, high cholesterol, premature death, stroke, diabetes, both type 1 and type 2, infertility, and this is the case for both men and women, have an increased risk for infertility as being associated with obesity, gallbladder disease, osteoarthritis, as well as osteopenia, which is an early indicator of osteoporosis, hernias, various types and sites of cancer. I just see the word cancer is missing from the slide. Sorry about that. That should be cancer in there. Type 2 diabetes risk is tripled if somebody is obese, and physical fitness is the best protection from the health risk of obesity. Even if somebody is obese, if they are physically active, they are less likely to have an increased risk of every single one of these health factors. Let's talk for a minute about the psychological complications associated with overweight and obesity. Again, we could teach an entire course just on the psychological complications. Let's just focus on a few. We know from lots of research that obesity is a risk factor for depression, and this is particularly the case among women. What's very sad is that the majority of obesity research will not accept people who have a diagnosis of depression into their study cohort, meaning that as we continue to do research about overweight and obesity, we tend to screen out participants who are depressed. And that's because the depression can have an influence on other aspects of the programs. Very sad, because we know this is one of the main problems that affects somebody when they're overweight and obese, and it makes sense. Weight bias, negative attitudes affecting interactions from people. Weight bias is a really big problem through everyday life, but especially in the medical community. You know, we have such a huge overweight and obese population needing medical care, and yet teaching of overweight and obesity empathy is not part of medical school, and a lot of doctors suffer from weight bias when they talk with their patients. This week, I've posted a video that I want you to watch from Films on Demand. It's called Fat and Happy, and yes, it's a little bit old. It stars Alan Alda, but I want you to watch it because at the heart of it, it's got some really good messages, and it focuses on this need for medical empathy and the focus on weight bias against overweight and obese populations that I think is really important and is not nearly enough discussed. We also see stereotypes leading to stigma, rejection, prejudice, discrimination, isolation, and self-esteem issues. We know that people who are overweight and obese are less likely to be able to get accepted for rent. They're less likely to be able to get bank loans. They're less likely to be able to get scholarships to college. Hindered academic and social functioning. This is especially the case for kids and teens from preschool all the way through college. And bullying and teasing. Again, I'm going to raise this again when we're together in our synchronous class talking about pediatric overweight and obesity. But especially among overweight youth, we see that 30% of girls and 24% of boys on average are teased at school on a daily basis. Vulnerability to bias increases with body weight, and among the heaviest youth, 60% report being victimized at some point simply because of their weight. Let's talk about the difference between body weight and body fatness, because body weight and body fatness are not the same thing, but they're often used interchangeably in the media when talking about issues related to overweight and obesity, and I want you to understand what the difference is. So really, when we're talking about body weight and body fatness and energy balance, what we need to keep in mind is that when more food is consumed than is needed, excess fat accumulates in the fat cells and the body's adipose tissue where it's stored. And it doesn't matter whether or not the calories come from fats, proteins, or carbohydrates. If you're taking in more calories than what your body expends, it leads to weight gain. It also leads to body fat gain. Adipose tissue is what regulates the secretion of leptin, which is involved with appetite regulation. Leptin is a hormone in your body. It's your "I'm ready to stop eating" hormone. It's what signals to the brain that you're full. When your energy supplies run low, your stored body fat is drawn on. See, what's really great is that when you carry excess calories and you carry excess body fat, you're really carrying excess energy. Now, of course, it's not great to carry excess body fat, but because you're carrying excess energy, your body is just waiting for you to use that up. That's why exercise and calorie burning is so important, even if you're already at a normal weight. Your body is hardwired to use that energy, so use it up. Physical activity is the best way to do it. Your change in energy stores happen over time. Energy in minus energy out. But it's not just a one-time or a week-long event. So it's great if you exercise. But if you're only going to exercise 1 day a week, 2 days a week, you're probably not going to make a large difference in your overall body weight or your body fatness. The energy in foods and beverages, that's the contributor to the equation of energy in, and the energy out is more difficult to determine because it's partly dependent upon your lifestyle and your metabolism. For example, an apple has 70 calories, a candy bar has 250 calories. So what's your lifestyle? Are you more likely to reach for the apple? Are you more likely to reach for a candy bar? Or does it really depend what kind of stress you're going under and what's happening in your body right now? What's happening in your life? For each extra 3,500 calories you consume, you store 1 pound of body fat. Similarly, think about it the other way. Once you've burned 3,500 calories, you lose a pound of body fat. Take the past 7 days. For each day, how many calories do you think you went over your daily allowance of 2,000 to 3,000 calories per day, or however many calories per day you need for your height and weight? What if you went over that limit by 600 calories each day? So for each day, you had an extra soda and a side of fries. In 7 days, you would have consumed an extra 4,200 calories than what your daily allowance is, right? So that's more than a pound. What if you don't exercise? Those extra 4,200 calories aren't being burned, and thus you're going to gain weight and also body fat. There are really 3 major components of the energy outside of your body's energy budget, as I like to call it. They include your basal metabolic rate, your physical activity, and the thermic effect of food. Let's start with your BMR, because the basal metabolic rate matters more than anything for determining how many calories you're going to burn. Remember, your BMR is the amount of energy you need just to sit there and exist, just when you're laying on the couch and doing nothing. This is how much energy your body uses for all of the systems in your body to work. And the best way to increase your basal metabolic rate is to increase your muscle mass. So whether you're doing resistance training for that through resistance bands or dumbbells or machines or yoga, just using your own body weight, anything you can do to increase your muscle mass will help increase your basal metabolic rate. The other factor that determines how many calories you burn are your voluntary activities and your exercise. Now, a lot of people like to just think of this in terms of their physical exercise that's more structured, that they do on purpose. When somebody sets out to take a walk or take a run or to join an exercise class or something like that. But I want you to also think about the other activities that you get in your day. For example, are you somebody who has to sit at a desk all day long in front of a computer? Well, then you're likely not burning as many calories as somebody who's a teacher who has to move around a classroom a lot, or a waitress, or a nurse, or any other profession where you're on your feet a lot. Those people tend to burn so many calories in their everyday life that they have an easier time keeping their weight off. The last energy out component a lot of people don't know about, and I just think it's so wonderful, and it's one of the reasons why, I think we talked about this a little bit in week 1 about the need for many small meals throughout the day, but it's one of the reasons why I always like to remind people, try not to go too long without eating, because your body needs so much energy just to digest your food. Approximately up to 10% of the number of calories you burn each day come just from your body digesting your food. It's called the thermic effect of food. And so when you eat more often, so if you were to eat breakfast and then a small snack and then lunch and a small snack a couple hours later and then dinner and then maybe even a small snack before bedtime, you're going to earn much more calories, burn much more calories through your thermic effect than somebody who just ate a very square breakfast, lunch, and dinner type of day. There are common techniques for estimating body fatness. They have their pros and cons. They're not all perfect, but let me just tell you a little bit about what each of them are so you can make up your own mind as to whether or not maybe it's a test that you would like to have. A very popular body fatness test is the skin fold test. The problem with the skin fold test is that unless you're trained to accurately do the skin fold test, you're likely going to do it incorrectly. There are certainly easy skin fold calipers that you can buy for very cheap for yourself on Amazon, but if you haven't done it before, and you haven't been certified in how to do it, you're not going to get an accurate reading. People who are certified in skin fold tests will usually measure your body fat through your skin folds in 3 places on your body. Usually they'll measure it on your triceps, on your biceps, and on around your middle section. And you'll see that each time they do it, they measure it a few times because what they're looking for is an average measurement for each of those sections. It's a really good measure of body fat if it's done correctly, but my warning here is that most times it's not done correctly. Waist circumference is a really good measure of body fatness. Remember we talked before about the waist to hip ratio and calculating that. Well, your waist circumference and the waist to hip ratio have been shown in many research studies to have a very high correlation in terms of accuracy for body fatness. Underwater weighing. This is something that you see if you watch reality television and they're like beginning a fat camp type thing. A lot of times they'll do underwater weighing. They used to do this on The Biggest Loser. I know that at Temple University, if you're interested in underwater weighing for body fatness, they usually do it once or twice a year over in the Independence Blue Cross Rec Center, and you can get it measured there. But basically, what happens when you're getting measured for your body fat with underwater weighing is that you get submerged underwater, and because you're underwater and you don't have your body weight influencing what happens on the scale, you can get a pretty accurate reading of how much of your weight is coming from muscle mass versus from body fatness. It used to be considered the gold standard. It's no longer. Conductivity, body fatness. Bioelectrical impedance. This is what the majority of digital scales are. If you buy a digital scale at any store and it tells you will also measure for body fat, it's using conductivity and bioelectrical impedance. The problem with this is it's so inaccurate because this depends on the hydration levels in your body. The hydration in your body is what conducts the bioelectrical system through to give you a body fat measure. So if you measure on one day and you're very well hydrated and the next day you're very dehydrated, you're going to get vastly different levels of body fatness measurement. So it's not a very accurate test. What's really considered the gold standard and the best way to measure body fatness is with a DEXA scan. You may have heard of DEXA scans before because they're used a lot to determine whether or not somebody has osteoporosis or osteopenia. They're also used to determine body fatness. And in fact, a DEXA scan is so accurate, it can even tell you if you have more body fat, for example, in your left arm than your right arm, which is very common since so many of us are right-handed and we use our right arm so much more. They tend to have less body fat on them than our left arms, which I think is pretty funny. So body fat composition and distribution. When you're looking at a man versus a woman, you're going to see that there are going to be different numbers that are recommended for health risks simply because women tend to have more body fat than men do. But on both, almost a third to half of your body composition is generally muscles, while about a quarter of your body composition is organs. 15% to 30% ideally is fat, and then the rest would be bone. So how much body fat is ideal? Well, first you have to decide what's the ideal body fat to have, and this really varies according to gender, lifestyle, and stage of life, and really what you're comfortable with. Think about what it is that you're asking the ideal body fat for. Is it for society's approval or is it for health? If it's for health, then the ideal body fat for men tends to be between 12 and 20% as body weight as fat, and for women between 20 and 30% body weight as fat. That tends to be the most protective in terms of health risk. Of course, if it's for society, well, that's a whole different story, and that depends on what society you live in. In America, we tend to have a little bit of difficult standards, right? Men can have a little gut going on, that seems to be okay. Women are expected to be very thin, like Heidi Klum. And either way you look at it, it's very unrealistic, and it's also very unhealthy. So a lot of what determines what your ideal body fat is not just what does your doctor say is good for your health, but what are you comfortable with, and how are you confident in your own skin, and what's the culture and environment in which you grew up. A lot of that is also going to determine how much body fat is ideal for you. I want to just talk for a quick second about the mystery of obesity. Some people will ask me pretty, often, how come, some people get fat and some people don't get fat? How come my sister is so thin and yet I have struggled with weight for my entire life? Is it heredity? Because if so, I don't understand how she can be one and I can be another. Is it eating habits? I feel like I hardly eat. I eat salads all day long and I can't lose weight. These are the kind of things I hear most often. And so let me give you a little bit of a, insight into what some of the research says about the mystery of obesity. So why do I eat that? I get this question all the time. Eating behavior is really regulated by signals in your body that are either pretty much go signals or stop signals. These are mechanisms that suppress your eating, and they're regulated by hormone. So what's the difference between hunger and appetite? And can you experience appetite without hunger? Think about that for a second. I get asked this question a lot. The answer is yes, you can experience appetite without hunger. Mainly because hunger is your body's physical need for food. We know when we're hungry because our stomachs start to growl or we get headaches. Sometimes we get very cranky, some of us. But appetite is your psychological desire for food. So maybe you pass by a restaurant that smells really good and all of a sudden you're really craving whatever is inside, or you see a commercial for one of your favorite foods and oh my gosh, you just start to salivate for it. Or maybe you think of certain foods that you associate with certain family members or holidays or friends or events, and so you start to get an appetite for that food. That's the psychological desire for food. If I said to you, what are you craving? What do you have a yen for right now? Right? That wouldn't be a question about your hunger. That would be a question about your appetite. Hunger is stimulated by an absence of food in the digestive tract. That's it. It's very boring. It's your body's hormone levels saying to your brain, hey, I'm missing food in here. I need to eat something. And ghrelin is the hormone that stimulates the brain to know that. When you think of the word go, think of the word ghrelin, right? The two of them go together. Ghrelin means go. Ghrelin says to your brain, hey brain, I'm hungry. I need to eat something. This stimulates something in the brain to help you eat. But your stop mechanism, that's where leptin comes in. Leptin, the way I like to tell people to remember that leptin is stop, leptin is like put a lid on it. It says to your brain, I'm done, I've had enough. And this really suppresses your appetite in response to a gain in body fat. Depending on your body fat level, your leptin levels will change. Look at this picture. This is from a research study where the mouse on the right is genetically predisposed to obesity but lacks the gene for producing leptin. So you see that this mouse is morbidly obese. The mouse on the left has the same genetic predisposition to obesity but remains lean because it receives leptin injections. In fact, one of the best ways to ensure that your body is going to have very good leptin receptors is to eat well. As we continue to eat processed foods and chemical foods, and especially foods with high fructose corn syrup, our body becomes less able to produce leptin. And when we can't produce leptin, we can't tell our brain, hey, I'm full, I'm hungry. And this is very dangerous. This is one of the reasons why we see that so many overweight children grow up to be overweight adults. Because in childhood, their brain, from their already excessive diet of processed food, will often stop processing the kind of leptin they need, and they lose their ability to determine when satiation occurs, when the digestive organs signal the brain that enough food has been consumed. Right? So this is when your leptin kicks in. It says, I'm good, brain, I'm done, I've had enough food. And satiety is that feeling of fullness that you get that lasts you until your next meal. But hunger always outweighs satiety in the appetite control system. So even if you think you've had enough, if your body senses that it needs more, it's going to let your brain know, and you're going to want to eat again fairly quickly. This is important to keep in mind when you're trying to decide how much of your diet to base around processed foods. One of the reasons why I recommend only 20% isn't just because of your disease risk, but also because with processed foods, there are so many additional chemicals in there that interfere with your satiety and your satiation that you will frequently end up needing to eat again before your body needs food. It's what your brain does to you. It's really interesting the way it screws up with those hormone levels. Studies of human behavior identify stimuli that lead to overeating and note that people can override signals of satiety and hunger and eat whenever they wish, right? So it's not a perfect system. If you see something that you really want to eat and you just had a meal 15 minutes ago, there's nothing that's going to stop you from eating it. And so overeating and binge eating continues to be a huge problem. Do you ever say to yourself, why did I eat that? Well, variety and availability are very strong influences to eat, even when you're not hungry. Sometimes I know for myself, if I'm in a social situation with a bunch of friends and they're enjoying something, even if it's not something that I really wanted, I know isn't good for me or isn't even really that satisfying, I'll probably eat it too, just because it's there, it's something I don't usually have, and they're having it with me. Stress is also a big factor that can cause people to overeat, especially comfort foods. And comfort foods tend to be high in fat and sugar. External stimuli can promote eating, such as the time of day. So do you tend to be somebody who's more hungry in the evening while you're watching TV? Do you tend to be somebody who needs a lot to eat in the morning? Is it in the middle of your day that you hit a slump and all of a sudden you need to eat a lot of snacks? It's different for every person. Large portions encourage overeating. We have lots of research that shows people are just as full when they have a smaller portion on their plate if that's all they're presented with. But if people are presented with larger portions, more food, they're going to overeat even if they're not hungry and they didn't eat all of those calories. Eating with others can also encourage us to eat more. We know we are always more likely to eat additional helpings when we're in a situation with additional people versus when we're at home by ourselves. Genetics and obesity. A person's genetic inheritance greatly influences but does not ensure the development of obesity. This cannot be understated. However, for someone with at least one obese parent, statistically, the chances of becoming obese is estimated to fall between 30 and 70%. The environment must provide the means necessary to become obese, even though you may be predisposed to becoming obese. So if you were an overweight child and you had overweight parents, but you move out on your own and you in your home keep healthier foods and try to be physically active, you are not going to become obese just because your parents were obese and just because you're an obese child. Lifestyle does intervene and make a difference. It used to be that if you had little money, you would be more likely to be thin because you couldn't afford food. That's what American society used to be. But today, the environment is so different. Now fast food is very cheap, widely available, heavily advertised, and extremely potent in making you obese. Many poorer demographics rely on fast food for the majority of their diet. Remember, environment has a huge influence on what you eat, and it certainly has a huge influence on obesity. It is officially a very important health epidemic. I want to end you with this slide because we won't have a lot of time in this class to talk about physical inactivity and activity, but it's so important, and so it may be something that you might want to consider for one of your papers in this class. Some people may be obese, but it's not just because they eat too much. They also likely move too little. Ask yourself, in what ways do you spend your leisure time? A lot of times people tend to think of physical activity, again, as something that is structured, that they set out to do. But I like to always remind people it doesn't have to be this way. Structured activities do influence your calorie cost a lot, but so do unstructured activities. These charts help to give you an idea about approximately how many calories you burn for these structured activities based on the amount of time that you do them. So if any of these look familiar to you and you just want to see what that's like, then do it. But please keep in mind that building physical activity throughout your day into your day also does matter. Instead of letting your dog out in the backyard, take your dog for a walk. Help with that pet overweight and obesity rate. Instead of emailing your colleague, think about walking down the hall and talking to her. And little things do make a big difference. In what ways do you spend your leisure time? I'm going to leave you here. When we meet with our synchronous class this week, we're going to focus more on overweight and obesity in children and teenagers. It's a big problem for children and teenagers, just as it is a big problem for adults. Enjoy your readings and your movies this week. I hope you're going to find them very interesting. Take care.